The phone rang at 9 noon in the morning while I was reaching behind my own back for the last button on my wedding dress. No one was there to fasten it. I told everyone I had it handled because telling people I had it handled was the only thing I knew how to do. I saw my sister's name on the screen and I answered with the button still loose. Renata didn't say hello. Don't wait for Dad. She said soft and sweet the way she got right before something cruel. He chose to stand with me. I pressed my hand flat against the doorframe. How could you do this? I whispered. There was a smile in her voice. You should have known your place. I almost believed I'd walk in alone. I was wrong about who would be standing in that room. So was she. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. I'm Sierra. I'm 33, and for 14 months I had quietly held my family together with both hands, until the morning my sister told me to let go. I'm a home health nurse in a small Ohio town. The kind of person other people call when something breaks. This is the story of the wedding they were certain I would walk into alone. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. 14 months before that phone call, I sat on the floor of my mother's bedroom at 3 in the morning, counting her breaths. The pancreatic cancer had moved fast. By the end, I was the only one who stayed the nights. Renata said she couldn't with the kids. Dad couldn't either. Though he was right down the hall, because watching Mom go was a thing he didn't have the spine for. So it was me. I learned the rhythm of her morphine, the angle of her pillows, the smell of the lavender sachet she kept tucked by her wrist because the hospital sheets frightened her. That lavender got into everything. My hair, my scrubs, the inside of my coat. When she died at dawn, I was the one who called the funeral home. And I was the one who told Dad, and I was the one who picked the hymns because nobody else could form a sentence. And somewhere in those gray weeks, without anybody deciding it out loud, I became the one who handled things. The bills, the paperwork, the phone calls. It felt like love, being needed that much. It took me a long time to understand they are not the same thing. You can be the most necessary person in a family and still be the one nobody saves a seat for. But I didn't know that yet. Back then, I thought if I just kept everything from falling, eventually somebody would notice the hands doing the holding. I kept my hands full, so I would never have to hold them out and ask. That was my mistake, and it took a wedding to show me. I thought being needed was the same as being loved. Daniel found me on a Tuesday at the medical supply counter, both of us reaching for the same box of gloves, and he apologized like he'd knocked over a lamp. We'd been together 2 years. He was a contractor, good with his hands and quiet with his words. And when I told him about my family, he never once said I should fix it. He just held the door and let me decide. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was at my kitchen table in town doing what I always did on Sunday nights. I opened my banking app. I confirmed the auto payment for the homeowner's insurance on the family homestead, the one Dad's pension stopped covering after Mom's medical bills ate the savings. I topped up the escrow shortfall for the property taxes, the way I had every quarter since the funeral. Then I logged into Dad's Medicare portal, fixed the supplemental form he'd filled out wrong again, and reordered his blood pressure prescription before it lapsed. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. The work that holds a family up is never the work anybody photographs. My phone buzzed while I was finishing. A text from Dad, short and careful, the way he got when Renata had been talking to him. Honey, about walking you down the aisle, let's talk later. Later. He'd been saying later for a week. I set the phone face down and pressed my thumb against the worry between my eyebrows. Daniel looked up from the couch. He'll come around, he said. I wanted to believe him, but I'd watched my father avoid hard rooms his whole life, and a wedding is the hardest room there is. I should have heard the warning in that word. Later, Renata showed up at my house that Thursday, which meant she needed something. She came in without knocking. 2 kids and a diaper bag. And that bright, tired energy she'd carried since the divorce. Cole was 11 and stared at his shoes. Lily was 7 and hugged my leg. My sister had been drowning for 2 years. The marriage gone. The rent always 1 week ahead of her. The second job that never quite covered it. I'd co-signed her apartment lease so she'd have somewhere to put the kids. I never brought it up. She brought it up constantly. And that way people do when a kindness sits in them like a splinter. I hate to ask, she said, which is how every ask started. She needed $400 for Cole's braces consult. I wrote the check. She tucked it away, and then, casually, while pouring herself coffee in my kitchen, she said the thing she'd really come to say. You know you make everything about you. Mom's last months, now this wedding. I held very still. I take care of things, Renata. That's not the same. She smiled at me over the mug. Dad needs his grandkids right now. You'd understand if you had any. There it was. The lever. She controlled when Dad saw Cole and Lily. She'd figured out it was the one thing he couldn't survive losing, 14 months into being a widower in a too-quiet house, and she had her hand on it. She kissed my cheek, gathered the kids, and left me holding a $400 check stub and the first cold understanding of what was coming. She'd found the one string Dad couldn't bear to have cut, and she was already pulling it. I didn't sit on it. That's the part people never believe. I drove the 20 minutes out to the homestead on Route 9 that same evening, because I have never been the kind of woman who waits to be rescued from a problem I can see coming. The gravel crunched under my tires in the dark, that sound I'd known my whole life. And Dad's porch light was the only one on for a mile. I found him at the kitchen table with the TV murmuring and a plate he hadn't touched. Dad, I said, I want to talk about the wedding. Plainly. He wouldn't look up from the placemat. It's getting complicated, honey. It's not complicated. You're my father. You walk me down the aisle. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. Your sister feels like the family's splitting. She says if I make a fuss, she'll keep the kids home for a while. There it was again. Out loud this time. I kept my voice level, the way I do with frightened patients. Then let's all sit down. You, me, Renata. Get it in the open. He shook his head before I finished. I can't push her, Sierra. I'll lose them. And I understood the trap fully. The way you understand a current that's already past your knees. If I forced him, I'd be the one tearing his grandchildren away from a grieving old man. Renata had built it so that my fighting for him would look exactly like hurting him. I drove home with the gravel sound, following me out the lane. Her words sat in the truck with me the whole way. You should have known your place. I'd known my place for 14 months. My place was holding everything up. I just hadn't said it yet. Aunt Prue called the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. She was my mother's older sister, 70, the keeper of the family's reputation in a town where the church potluck was still a kind of court. Sierra, honey, I'll get right to it. Prue never got right to anything. She circled. People are talking. Renata says you've cut the family off. I haven't cut anyone off, Aunt Prue. I'm getting married. A long, wounded sigh came down the line. Your mother, God rest her, would hate to see this. Can't you just be the bigger person? I'd been the bigger person at every funeral, every holiday, every 3 a.m. There's a point where being the bigger person just means being the one who absorbs the blow, so no one else has to. What exactly is Renata saying I did? I asked. Aunt Prue, who couldn't help herself, told me. My sister had been on the phone for a week to half the county. The story was that I'd grown cold and proud, that I thought my nursing degree made me better than them, that I'd run the family like an accountant ever since Mom died, and now I didn't want them at my wedding. None of it was true. All of it was useful. I see, I said, and I did. Finally, see the shape of the whole thing. If you've ever been the one everybody leans on and nobody thanks, the one whose boundaries get called selfish the second you set one, stay with me. What I did next wasn't loud. It was just true. Comment. I see her and keep watching. Because the morning of the wedding, a door is going to open, and I want you in the room when it does. Here's what made it ache. We were supposed to get married in the apple orchard behind the homestead. My great-grandfather planted those trees. I'd run between them as a girl, climbed them, buried a parakeet under, the oldest one when I was 9. Daniel and I had spent months on it. String lights between the branches, hay bales hauled in, my mother's recipe for cider on warming plates. For the first time in my life, I was going to be the person standing in the center of that family land. The one the day was about. Not the nurse, not the handler, not the one clearing plates while everyone else laughed. Just the bride. I'd let myself want it more than I'd wanted anything in years. Renata knew that. Of course she knew. We'd grown up in the same house. She knew exactly which want would cost me the most to lose. She started circling it on the phone with Prue, dropping it into family conversation like a seed. Funny how Sierra just assumed she could have the orchard. It's family land, isn't it? Not hers. I told myself it was nothing. The orchard had been promised. Dad had said yes months ago, back when he could still say yes to me. But a promise from a man who can't survive. Losing his grandchildren is not a promise. It's a hope wearing a promise's coat. I lay awake that night running the cost of moving a wedding 3 weeks out and told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. I was being early. The gravel of that lane, the lavender in my mother's old room, the trees my family had stood under for 100 years. Renata was about to take all of it and call it keeping the peace. That night, I did something I'm not proud of, and then something I am. First, I opened the banking app and I scrolled. 14 months of it. The insurance payments, the tax escrow, the pharmacy, charges under Dad's name that I'd quietly covered, the lease I'd co-signed. I added it up, and the number was large enough that I sat back in my chair. Then I did the thing I regret. I printed it, all of it, into a neat folder. Statement after statement. The whole invisible architecture of what I'd been carrying. I sat there and I imagined the family dinner where I'd open that folder. I imagined laying it on the table in front of Prue and Renata and Dad, and reading the figures out loud, slow, watching their faces change as they understood finally exactly how much of their comfortable little world I'd been holding up while they called me cold. The fantasy was warm. It was so warm. My friend Dana, a nurse I'd worked beside for 9 years, came by the next day for coffee, and I showed her the folder. She whistled low. Sierra, make them see what you actually do for them. Lay it out. Let the whole family watch. And I wanted to. God, I wanted to. There's a special hunger in being unseen for that long. A hunger to finally make people look. I held the folder in my lap that whole evening like it was a weapon I'd been issued. I was certain that was the path. I'd expose them. I'd make them understand the arithmetic of everything they'd taken for granted. I went to bed sure of it. I had the wrong weapon in my hands, and it would take my mother to show me. The call came on a Saturday 10 days out. Dad's number but Renata's voice doing the talking in the background, coaching. "Honey," he said, "about the orchard." I closed my eyes. "I think it's best we don't do the wedding out here. Keep things calm. It's family land. Renata thinks. Renata thinks." I repeated soft. "Now, don't be like that." I wasn't being like anything. I was standing in my kitchen in town, 10 days from my wedding, listening to my father give away the one place that was supposed to be mine, because giving it away was easier than holding a boundary. I heard the homestead screen door bang on his end. I heard, faintly, the gravel of the lane. A car pulling in. Renata's. Come to make sure he finished the job. He didn't even get out of the chair to tell me. He did it over the phone with my sister parked in the driveway like a foreman. "Okay, Dad," I said. "Okay." And I hung up before my voice could do anything I'd regret. I stood there a long time. The orchard was gone. 100 years of my family's trees, the cider on the warming plates, the spot under the oldest tree. Gone. 10 days out to keep a peace that was never mine to keep. I should have felt nothing but rage. Mostly, What I felt was the strange, vertiginous lightness of a thing breaking that you'd been bracing for so long. Your arms had forgotten any other position. I'd been thrown out of my own family's land. And I was still, that very night, scheduled to auto-pay the insurance that kept its roof from leaking. The absurdity of that didn't escape me. It would matter later more than I knew. Daniel found me sitting on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, which is not where I usually keep my feelings. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down next to me on the floor, knees up, the way you sit with someone, instead of across from them. "We'll get married in our own backyard," he said. "I'll build an arch this weekend. I've got the cedar." It was a good offer. It was a kind, solid, true offer. From a kind, solid, true man. And I couldn't say yes to it. Not yet. And the reason shames me a little even now. I still wanted my father. I still wanted, underneath everything, for Walt Overton to wake up one morning and choose his daughter. And I knew a backyard wedding with a cedar arch would be admitting that he never would. So I said, "Let me think." And then, this is the part, I picked my phone up off the floor, and I reordered Dad's blood pressure medication because it was due. Because the pharmacy had texted. Because 14 months of reflex doesn't switch off just because your heart's been kicked. I was still tending the roots of a house I'd just been thrown out of. Daniel watched me do it. He didn't say anything, but I saw him see it. The whole grotesque shape of it. A woman propping up the people stepping on her. "Sierra," he said gently, "who's holding you up?" I didn't have an answer. I'd built my whole self around never needing one. And somewhere out on Route 9, in a house I was still keeping warm with my own money, my father sat alone and let my sister decide who got to love him. I went to bed angry. I woke up with a plan I'd regret. For 3 days I rehearsed it, not out loud. In my head, in the shower, on my drives between patients, the speech, the folder. I'd walk into the family supper Prue was already planning. The let's all make peace before the wedding supper. And I would set the folder down on the table next to the casserole, and I would open it. I scripted the opening line a dozen ways. "Before anyone talks about family loyalty, I'd like to read you some numbers." I scripted Prue's face going pale. I scripted Renata's mouth opening and nothing coming out. I scripted my father finally understanding the size of what he'd let his daughter carry. In the fantasy, I was calm and devastating. And they all sat there and looked at me. Looked. Really looked. For the first time in 14 months. I wanted to be seen so badly I could taste it. I had the receipts. I had the moral high ground. I had 9 years of Dana telling me I gave too much and got nothing back. And now I had the proof in a manila folder on my passenger seat, riding around town with me like a co-conspirator. You should have known your place. Fine, I thought. I'll show them my place. I'll show them every dollar of it. I was so sure. I want you to know how sure I was, because it's going to matter when I tell you I didn't do it. I was a day from walking into that supper and detonating the truth in front of everyone I was related to. I had my hand on the pin. And then I drove out to the homestead, to collect my mother's things for the wedding. And my mother, 14 months in the ground, stopped me. But first, Renata wanted coffee. "Just us," she texted, "sisters." I knew better and went anyway because part of me still kept hoping a door would open in her that never did. We sat in the diner off Main and she stirred her coffee and studied me. And I realized within a minute that this wasn't reconciliation, it was reconnaissance. She wanted to know if I was going to do something. Those were her words. At the wedding or the supper. Whether I was going to make a scene. She was scared of the folder I didn't know she'd guessed at. "I just don't want Dad put in the middle," she said. "He's fragile." "You put him in the middle, Renata." She laughed short. "You really think you're the good one?" Then she said the thing I've turned over 100 times since. "Mom always loved you more. You got the soft version of her." I got the one who was disappointed. I sat there stunned. because it was the exact inverse of the truth. I was the one who'd cleaned my mother and counted her breaths and chosen the hymns. I was the one holding the family up with both hands while my sister told the whole county I was cold. And inside her, somehow, lived a completely sincere story where she was the overlooked one and I was the favorite, reclaiming a throne. Her cruelty wasn't strategy. It was a wound she genuinely believed in. That didn't excuse a single thing she'd done, but it told me something useful. She was never going to see the version of me that was true, no matter how many numbers I read aloud. You cannot fact-check a person out of a story they need to survive. The folder wouldn't reach her. Nothing would. I just didn't know yet what would. I just didn't know yet what would. I drove out to the homestead Thursday afternoon while Dad was at his cardiology appointment, the one I'd scheduled. The gravel announced me to an empty house. I let myself in to collect what I needed from Mom's sewing room, her veil, the lace she'd saved for me since I was small. The little things a daughter takes from a mother's hands when the mother can't hand them over herself. The sewing room still smelled like her. Lavender, faint, soaked into the curtains and the thread. On the shelf sat her old tin of sewing things, the one with the faded rose lid. And I opened it the way you open anything that belonged to someone you've lost, slowly, braced. Inside, on top of the spools and the pins, was her good embroidered handkerchief, the white one with her initials in the corner. The satin edge gone soft and frayed, from a lifetime of her thumb worrying it, and folded under it, a slip of paper in her handwriting, not addressed to anyone, just left there, the way she left small truths around the house, for whoever was ready to find them. I read it standing up, then I had to sit. Place isn't where they seat you, she'd written. It's where you decide to stand. Stand, Sierra. I don't know when she wrote it, near the end, I think, when she'd watched the family already starting to arrange me into the corner I'd occupy. She'd seen it coming. She'd seen me. I pressed my thumb against that frayed satin edge, the exact spot her own thumb had worn smooth over 40 years, and something in me that had been braced for 14 months, finally, quietly, set itself down. The folder in my passenger seat suddenly felt like the smallest, saddest weapon in the world. My mother had handed me a better one. I stayed too long. I was still sitting in the sewing room when I heard the gravel. Dad's truck, back early. I should have called out. I didn't. I sat very still, in my mother's chair, and listened to my father move through the house thinking he was alone. He went to the hall closet. I heard the door, and then a long silence. And then, a sound I'd never heard him make. He'd taken out my mother's winter coat, the gray wool one she'd worn for 30 winters. And he was holding it. I could tell by the muffled way his voice came, he was talking to it, low. I don't have it in me, he said. 2 fights. I can't. A pause. She's strong, Maggie. Sierra's the strong one. She'll be all right. That's the part that gutted me. Not the cowardice, the math of it. He'd looked at his 2 daughters and decided that because I could survive being abandoned, I was the acceptable one to abandon. My strength had become the reason I got nothing. I sat in the dark and understood my father completely. And I did not forgive him. And both of those things were true at once. He was a frightened old man, drowning in grief, clinging to the one thread he had left. And he was also a man choosing right then to let his daughter walk into her wedding alone, because it was easier than holding a hard line, human and unforgivable. I waited until he shuffled to the kitchen, and then I slipped out the front. The gravel gave me away on the lane, and through the window I saw him look up, just for a second, and then look back down at the coat in his hands. He couldn't even hold my eyes across the driveway. I filed that image away. I'd see it again. I went to Miriam's that evening because I didn't know where else to take the thing my mother had started in me. Miriam Vance taught my 5th grade class 30 years ago and never quite stopped teaching me. She's 71 now, sharp as a tack with a kitchen that always smells like bread. I'd kept up with her my whole life. She was the first adult who ever told me I had worth on a day I'd been useless, when I'd failed a spelling test and cried. And she'd crouched down and said something I've carried ever since. I sat at her table and told her all of it. The orchard, the folder, my father, and the coat, the note in my mother's tin. She listened the way good teachers listen, without rushing to fix. Then she reached across and put her old hand over mine. "Let me ask you something," she said. "This folder? Who's it for?" "For them. To make them see." "No," she said, gentle but certain. "It's for you. You want them to hand you your worth. Sierra. They don't have it. They never did." I started to argue and stopped. Then what do? She smiled at me, the same smile from 30 years ago. You stop waiting at a door that won't open, and you notice who's already standing in the room. She squeezed my hand. "You don't walk in alone, honey. You walk in with whoever already showed up." I sat with that. Whoever already showed up. Not whoever I could force to show up. Not whoever owed me. Whoever was already there and had been all along while I'd been staring so hard at the people who weren't. I drove home that night with the folders still on the seat, but I'd stopped thinking of it as a weapon. I had a different idea forming. A better one. The next morning, Tom Brandt called. I'd nursed his mother, Eunice, through her last 3 months the winter before, sat with her, managed her pain, was holding her hand at the end while Tom drove in from 2 counties over. Families don't forget the person who carries their mother gently out of the world. Tom called to thank me, awkward and warm, because it was near the anniversary, and he'd been thinking of her. We talked a while and he asked how I was, and because I was tired and the wound was fresh, I told him more than I meant to about the orchard, about needing a new place 10 days out. He went quiet. Then he said, "Sierra, our barn, the old timber one we restored after Mom passed. It's just sitting there." I started to say I couldn't possibly. "You carried our mother out of this world," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "Let us carry your day, please. It'd mean something to us." I sat down on my front step. "The thing I want you to understand is that this was not a gift falling out of the sky. This was a harvest. 3 months of cold drives and night shifts, and a dying woman's hand in mine. That's what was coming back to me now, in the shape of a restored timber barn, with string lights and room for everyone who mattered. You reap what you plant. And I'd been planting kindness in this town for 9 years, without ever once expecting the field to feed me back. I told Tom I'd think about it, because I still couldn't quite believe a door would open that I hadn't pried open, myself. But it had. And another idea, the real one, was clicking quietly into place behind it. The peacemaking supper happened that Sunday at Prue's, and I went, folder on the passenger seat, still half convinced I'd use it. The whole family was there. Renata and the kids. Dad silent at the end of the table. Prue orchestrating casseroles and tension. I felt the folder out in the truck like a held breath. Prue started in before the plates were down. "Now, we're all family, and family forgives. Sierra, I think you owe your father and sister a little grace." And there it was, my opening gift wrapped. I could go to the truck. I could bring the folder in. I could lay 14 months of receipts on Prue's good tablecloth and read them out, slow, and watch every face at that table rearrange itself. My hand actually went to my keys. And then I looked at my father. Really looked. He was staring at his plate, smaller than I'd ever seen him, a man who talked to his dead wife's coat in an empty house. And I understood, with my mother's note still folded in my coat pocket, that if I read those numbers aloud, I would break him in front of everyone. And I would be fighting Renata on her own ground, the ground of who owes what, who's the victim, who gets to be the wronged one. I'd be making it about me and about money and about being seen, which is exactly the game she'd win. I tipped my hand off my keys. "You're right, Aunt Prue," I said, calm as still water. "Family forgives. I forgive all of you." Renata's eyes narrowed. She'd expected a fight and gotten grace, and Grace frightened her more. The folder stayed in the truck. I drove home and dropped it unopened in the recycling bin. I finally knew what my real weapon was, and it wasn't paper. Here is what I did instead, and I did it. Quietly over 3 evenings at my kitchen table, I built my father a handover. Not a weapon, a gift of the most honest kind. I made a clean, organized packet of everything I'd been silently carrying for 14 months. Every account, the insurance policy and when it auto-drafted, the property tax escrow and the dates it came due, the Medicare logins, the supplemental forms, the pharmacy auto refills, the names and numbers of every person I'd been quietly coordinating on his behalf. I wrote it out in plain language, the way I'd write discharge instructions for a patient going home to manage on their own, because that's what this was. I was discharging myself. For 14 months, I'd been the machine keeping that house running, and no one had ever seen the machine because a working machine is invisible. So, I was going to hand my father the keys to it, all of them, clearly labeled, and step back. Not to punish him, to free us both. He couldn't keep depending on hands he refused to hold in daylight, and I couldn't keep being load-bearing for a family that called me cold. It hurt to type it. Every line was a thing I'd done out of love that had been taken as my due. But underneath the hurt was that same, strange lightness from the kitchen floor. The feeling of arms, remembering they were allowed to lower. When it was done, I had a folder again. A very different folder. Not the one that exposed them. The one that released me. I set it on the counter to give to Dad after the wedding, and I went to call Tom Brandt and tell him yes. Yes to the barn. Yes to a room that wanted me in it. Moving a wedding in 9 days should be impossible. It wasn't. Because I'm good at exactly one thing above all others. I organize the unorganizable under pressure. It's the nurse in me. I made the lists. I made the calls. And then the strangest, warmest thing happened. The town moved with me. Dana rallied the nursing crew to string the lights. The Brants hauled in hay bales and set their grandfather's timber barn glowing. A family whose father I'd sat with through hospice brought folding chairs. The diner off Main, where Renata had interrogated me over coffee, donated the cider. My mother's recipe, because the owner had loved my mother. Daniel built his cedar arch after all and set it at the barn's far end. Every call I made, someone said yes before I finished asking. I'd spent 9 years being the person this town called when things broke, and I had never once understood until that week that I'd been building something. A web. A net. A room full of people who would catch me if I ever stopped catching everyone else. The orchard was gone, and somehow what replaced it was bigger. I stopped trying to be invited to a family that kept seating me at the edge. I built a room of my own instead, full of people who'd chosen me. If you've ever had to do that, walk away from the table you were born at, and build your own, you already know what's coming. And you know it's worth it. Subscribe, so you don't miss the door opening, because in 2 days it's gonna swing wide, and my sister is going to be standing on the wrong side of it. The room was full before the wedding even started. Renata just didn't know it yet. Renata caught wind that I wasn't crumbling and it broke something loose in her. Her whole plan had assumed a particular ending. Me humiliated walking into a half-empty room without our father. Proof to the whole county that I'd isolated myself with my coldness. A bride alone is a story that confirms everything she'd been selling, but I wasn't going to be alone. And word of the Brandt barn was traveling and the cider and the lights, so she escalated. She called the cousins and said I'd snubbed the family by moving the wedding to strangers. She told Prue I hadn't invited real family. She posted something vague and wounded online about people who forget where they came from. Each move was meant to rebuild the story of Sierra, the cold one. But here's what she didn't account for. The people filling that barn weren't reading her posts. They were the families of patients I'd sat with at 4:08 a.m. They were nurses I'd covered shifts for. They didn't know her version, and they wouldn't have believed it, because they'd seen the actual me. the one who showed up. Renata was shouting a story into a room that had already met the truth. I heard from Dana that my sister had started to sound frantic on the phone, the way people do when the narrative they've built is coming apart in their hands. Walt was caught dead center, pulled between the daughters screaming the loudest, and the slow, sick realization that maybe the quiet one had been the one telling the truth all along. I didn't gloat. I just kept stringing lights. The wedding was tomorrow, and for the first time in 14 months, I wasn't bracing for a blow. I was getting ready to be happy. Renata could feel it flipping, so she made one last call the night before, to me. Renata's last call the night before was the one that became the morning's. But before she called, I'd already done the quiet thing. That evening at my kitchen table, I opened the banking app one final time as the family's invisible machine. I turned off the auto payment for the homestead insurance. I canceled the tax escrow draft. I logged the formal notice to remove myself as co-signer on Renata's lease, effective at its renewal, which was within my rights and time so no one was stranded mid-month. I wasn't cutting anyone off cruelly. I was handing the controls back to the people who'd insisted I had no place at the wheel. Then I emailed the handover packet to my father. I attached one short line at the top, and I kept it calm, the way I keep everything calm. Dad, here is everything I've been handling for the house and for you. It's all yours now, clearly labeled. You have everything you need to stand on your own. So do I. I love you. Sierra. I hit send, and I sat in the quiet of my own small kitchen in town, 20 minutes from the homestead I'd kept warm with my own money for over a year, and I felt the strangest peace. You should have known your place. I did. Finally. My place had been the foundation under all of them, and I just stepped off it, on purpose, in daylight. The house wouldn't fall tomorrow, but the people inside it were about to feel, for the first time, the full weight of what they'd been standing on. My phone lit up. Renata's name. I let it ring out. Whatever she had to say, she could say it in the morning. And she did. 9 Turas, the last button. The soft, cruel voice. You already know how that went. So let me open the door. The Brant barn glowed like something out of my mother's stories. It was a gold October afternoon. The timber walls warm with string lights, hay bales softened with quilts, my mother's cider steaming on the warming plates the diner had sent. I stood in the little side room they'd given me to dress in, and I finally reached behind my back and did up that last button, myself. The one no one had been there to fasten at 9,000 morning. I'd managed it alone all day. I could manage it alone now. But alone, it turned out, was not the same as lonely. My mother's embroidered handkerchief was wound around the stems of my bouquet, the white linen against the wildflowers, and my thumb found the frayed satin edge and worried it the way she always had. The lavender of her, faint, rose up from the linen and steadied me. Place isn't where they seat you. It's where you decide to stand. Stand, Sierra. Through the wall I could hear them. Not a half-empty room. Not the humiliated silence my sister had designed. I heard a barn full of voices, laughter, the scrape of chairs, the particular hum of 100 people who'd driven out of their way to be somewhere on purpose. Dana stuck her head in. You ready? It's packed out there. Standing room. My eyes stung. Who came? Everybody, she said, like it was obvious. Everybody you ever showed up for. They all showed up back. I picked up my bouquet, Clear's throat, the handkerchief, the lavender, the worn satin edge under my thumb. I walked to the doorway that opened onto the main floor of the barn. And someone gave the signal and the doors swung open. And there it was. The room I'd been told I'd walk into alone. It was the fullest room I had ever seen. Not one empty chair, 100 faces turning toward me, every one of them glad. The lie that I'd been abandoned died right there, with no speech at all. Just a door opening on the truth. Miriam was waiting just inside the doors, in her good blue dress, and she held out her arm to me. 71 years old, the first adult who ever told me I had worth. Standing in for every person who was supposed to and didn't. You don't walk in alone, she murmured as I took her arm. You never did. We started down the aisle between all those glad faces, slow. The way you savor a thing you waited your whole life for. And that's when the barn doors at the far back opened a second time. Renata stood there, framed in the October light. And I watched her face do something I'll remember as long as I live. She'd come, to witness, I think, the humiliation she'd built, to see her cold sister walk into an empty room. Instead, she found the room packed wall to wall. The cider steaming, the lights gold, a beloved teacher on my arm, and not one trace of the abandonment she promised the whole county. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. And behind her, half a step back, hesitating at the threshold, like a man at the edge of cold water, was my father. He'd come on his own, no Renata steering him for once. She was as shocked to see him there as I was. He'd gotten the handover packet I'd learn later, and somewhere in those clearly labeled pages he'd finally seen the size of what I'd carried. And something in him had moved. He stepped just inside the door. And then he couldn't lift his head. My father stood in the back of that glowing barn and stared at the floorboards. Unable to meet the eyes of the daughter he'd let go. Renata found her voice then too loud. For the room, the way the losing side always gets loud. Sierra, this is ridiculous. You should have known your place. And the whole barn went quiet. And I stopped. Miriam's arm still in mine. And I looked. At my sister, across all those silent watching faces. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I finally do, Renata, I said, calm as my mother's hand. My place was holding all of you up. I just set it down. There was no folder. No numbers read aloud. No receipts on a tablecloth. No inventory of everything I'd paid. I'd left that weapon in the recycling where it belonged. The payoff didn't need it. The truth was already standing in the room, in the shape of 100 people who came, and 2 who finally understood why that mattered. Renata's, you should have known your place, hung in the silence. And the silence answered it better than I ever could, because everyone in that barn could see, plainly, whose place this was. It was mine. I'd built it. My father lifted his head finally an inch, and his eyes were wet. And when he spoke, it was barely loud enough to carry. I read what you sent, he said. I didn't know. Sierra, I didn't know how much his voice gave out. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The man who couldn't hold my eyes across a gravel driveway was standing alone now. Truly alone. Because for the first time in 14 months, there was no one quietly holding him up from the shadows. He felt the full weight of the foundation the moment it stopped carrying him, and Renata felt it too. I watched it cross her face. The dawning understanding that she'd spent weeks fighting me for control of a man whose stability had never been hers to give or take. It had been mine. She'd told me to know my place. And in doing so, she'd shoved the one person out of it who kept the whole structure standing. They did it to themselves, every bit of it. I felt no triumph. Only a clean and quiet sorrow. And underneath that, something steady. Miriam patted my hand on her arm. "Shall we?" she said softly. And we did. We turned away from the door, away from my frozen sister and my crumpled father. And we walked the rest of the aisle through 100 people who were exactly where they wanted to be, toward Daniel and his cedar arch, and not one part of me looked back. Daniel was waiting under the cedar arch he'd built with his own hands, and when Miriam placed my hand in his, the whole barn exhaled into applause. We said our vows in a room that smelled of cider and hay and, faintly, lavender. I kept the handkerchief wound around my bouquet the entire time, my thumb finding that worn satin edge whenever my voice wavered. My mother present in the only way she could be. Somewhere in the back, I was aware of my father lowering himself onto a hay bale, sitting through the ceremony with his hat in his hands. Renata had gone, slipped out the way she'd come into the October light. I let her go. I didn't have a speech for her, and I didn't need one. The vows were the only words that mattered, and they were about a future, not a wound. When Daniel kissed me, 100 people I'd spent 9 quiet years showing up for rose to their feet, and the sound they made was the sound of being seen, finally, by the people who'd been seeing me all along. I looked out at that full glowing barn, and I thought about the morning. The loose button, the soft, cruel voice, the certainty that I'd walk in alone. I had been so sure I was alone. I had been wrong in the most beautiful way. A person can be wrong. My mother knew it before I did. She'd left it in a sewing tin for me to find. That my place was never the chair they pointed to. It was the ground I chose to stand on, and the people already standing there when the door swung open. I didn't walk in alone. I never had to. I just had to stop staring at the people who weren't there long enough to see the room that was full, the weeks after, told the rest. My father sat down with that handover packet and learned line by line what 14 months of being carried actually looked like. The insurance came due and he paid it, himself, late the first time, on time after that. The tax escrow, the Medicare forms, the pharmacy refills. All of it was his now, clearly labeled, exactly as I'd left it. He called me more in that first month than he had all year, and slowly the calls changed shape. They stopped being about what he needed and started being about nothing at all. The weather, a ball game, my mother. Once, near the end of a call, he said, "I should have walked you down that aisle." I didn't argue and I didn't absolve him. "Yes," I said, "you should have." It was the most honest thing we'd said to each other in years. Renata's leverage came apart on its own, the way a thing does when the structure under it is gone. She'd been trading on her control of the grandchildren, but Dad, standing on his own 2 feet for the first time, didn't snorts need her permission for his own stability anymore. He had the packet, he had the accounts, he had himself. The threat that had ruled him for a year lost its teeth. She didn't apologize. People that deep inside a story rarely do. But she got quieter, and the calls to the cousins stopped. And Prue, who'd preached that family forgives, found she had no scene left to manage. I kept the boundary my mother's note had taught me to keep. I help where I'm respected. I don't where I'm taken for granted. I'm still a nurse. I still show up for this town at 40 when something breaks. But I stopped being the invisible machine under a family that called the machine cold. Miriam came to Sunday dinners now. So did the Brants. So did Dana. The family I was born into got smaller and truer. The family I built without noticing got larger and warmer. And the two finally stood at a livable distance, out on Route 9. My father learned to cross his own gravel driveway and knock on his daughter's door in daylight. It took him a while. He's slow and he's 70. And he's still grieving. But he comes now on his own, and he holds my eyes when he does. The lavender of my mother is still in everything. Her handkerchief in my dresser drawer. The satin edge a little more worn now from my thumb instead of hers. I take it out sometimes and read the note again. Place isn't where they seat you. It's where you decide to stand. I stand now. In a room I built with people who chose me, and I have never once had to ask them to. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Your place was never the chair they pointed you to. It's the ground you choose to stand on, and the people who are already standing there when the door finally swings open. The loose button no one fastened. The gravel my father couldn't cross. The door that swung open on a room that was already full. If you've ever been the one holding it all up while they told you to know your place, set it down. And look around at who's been standing beside you the whole time. Share this with the women in your life who needs to hear it.